Hi there, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Math Essentials podcasts. This podcast is on scatterplots and linear trends. So, when we look at data in the real world, it becomes very important to try to understand relationships to that data. Collecting and analyzing it is necessary, and it can help us to understand how variables are related to each other. So, to better understand how variables are related, we can graph data relationships into what's called a scatter plot. And a scatter plot is a graph of ordered pairs, and it's used to evaluate if there's a type of relationship that exists between two variables. Now, if we notice a relationship, we can draw what's called a line of best fit. And it's drawn on a scatter plot to show the general trend in the data. So we can almost estimate the rate of a ordered pair or of a particular scatter plot by looking at the ordered data. So if we look at the example here, one of the things I'll notice is that a lot of the data tends to fall fairly close together. Notice that there's a couple here that kind of are a little bit outside, but notice most of the data follows a general trend. If I were to draw in a line of best fit, it's a line that's sort of as close to, maybe not connecting, but as close to as many of the data points as possible. Now notice that the data seems to follow a linear trend. And in this case, it looks fairly strong. It looks like the data in this particular example are fairly close together, and that there's a very strong relationship between what I am looking at here in the ordered pairs. Now, the line of best fit on a scatter plot provides us with the following information about relationships. So it gives us the shape. So we can tell if something's linear or nonlinear. So this one, for example, is not really linear. It's more curved. Right? The other examples, they're all linear trends. It can tell us the strength. So points that are very close together, like this one here, are very strong, meaning that the relationship between them is strong. Points that are very far apart are not as strong, meaning that the relationship between them is very weak or is not known. Also, we can tell direction, so we can tell if a relationship is going in a positive direction, meaning that one is increasing while the other increases, like these ones here, or negative, as one increases, the other decreases. So that's another thing that they can tell us. And it can also tell us the presence of outliers. So points of information or points of data that don't fall into a particular line. So this is an outlier right here. Now, we come to the word correlation. A correlation occurs if the degree of relatedness between the variables is strong. So in other words, if the data points are close together and the line of best fit touches as many of those points as possible, we have a strong correlation. If the data points are very far apart, and in fact, this one here, it would be very hard for me to put a line of best fit in because it doesn't appear that there's any line within that. It just kind of looks like a jumble of relatedness. This is a very weak or no correlation at all, meaning that there's no relationship in that information. So let's look at an example. So here's a real-world example for a quality control department, and the monitoring inner diameter of connector fittings. So this person here has collected the data about undersized fittings, which would be a huge issue if this was on an aircraft hydraulic system. And obviously this kind of information would let them know sort of how they're doing in terms of their rejection rate for whatever their quality control is. So collecting that information, we get a graph that looks like this. Now, to answer some of the questions, does the relationship between the size of production run and the number of fittings with an undersized inner diameter appear to be linear or not. Well, looking at the data, it looks like it's linear because the data points are distributed along a straight line. Okay, and if I was to draw a line of best fit, notice that it would fairly easily fall within a lot of those data points. So it is a linear there seems to be a linear relationship between the undersized inner diameter and the number of fittings in a production run. Now, should the line of best fit pass through the point 0, 0? In this case, it's not necessary. In a very small production run, all fittings could have the correct inner diameter. So it's not necessary that it falls within or falls to the point 0, 0. So looking at this correlation, does the correlation appear weak or strong? It actually appears fairly strong because notice that there's very few points on this line that are really falling out of a range. And the last question, examine the data for outliers. Well, I can see an outlier right here. Now, something that real world may account for this outlier could be manufacturing problems, could be a machine error, or something that would account for this one point here. Now, in the case of this data set here, and when calculating a rate, we would actually ignore the outlier. We would eliminate the outlier as the outlier is not going to be valuable in this example. Okay, so that includes our podcast on scatter plots and linear relations, and I hope that was helpful.